This video is brought to you by Squarespace. One of the foundational elements of miniature painting is brush control. So today we're going to take an in-depth look at how to control your brush and the various ways you can wield it alongside your palette and paints by using these three core principles: wetness, thickness, and texture. Principle 1, wetness. Managing how wet you keep everything is one of the absolute keys to controlling your brush, as well as how paint behaves when you apply it to the miniature. However, do not worry, as we have three key tools to help manage our wetness. Number 1, our wet palette, which helps to store our paint and also keeps it at a baseline of wetness. Number 2, our water glass, which lets us increase our wetness. And of course, number 3, our paper towel, which lets us remove wetness. To begin, let's establish our wetness baseline by using our wet palette. I know this is a video about brush control, but just trust me, the wet palette discussion is kind of essential to understand the later steps. A common mistake that I often see with wet palette users is that you're either keeping them too wet or too dry. And believe me, I know the struggle. It's very easy to let your wet palette maintenance slide and either make it too wet or let it dry out towards the end of the week. So let's pretend we're doing our weekly clean out of our wet palette, and I'll show you exactly how wet I like to keep mine, as well as how to maintain it. To start, I remove the old paper and then wash out the entire thing with soap and water, including the lid, the sponge, and the container itself. Once this is done, we can add both the sponge and fresh water back into the palette. And as you can see, I like to do this using a little squirt bottle, so I can better control where the water is going. Our goal here is to fully soak every part of the sponge without submerging it fully in water. So basically, as much water as the sponge will hold, and no more than that. A few drops of water at the bottom is fine, just so long as you don't have water pooling up around the edges and getting onto the paper. At this point, we can add a fresh paper to our palette, and as you can see, I can move it around freely without water sloshing around or getting up top, and this is about where I like to maintain it. The ideal we're going for is a nice moist area where paint can stay wet for days at a time, just not an area where the paint will get thinned down as soon as you place it on the palette or overnight while you're keeping your palette sealed up. As the week goes on, and depending on your climate, you will probably want to continue adding water to your palette as it dries out, but again, be sparse with this, not too much water. So now that we've established our wetness baseline and we are maintaining it, let's take a look at our other two wetness tools and how they interact with our wet baseline. First, before applying any paint to the brush, make sure your brush is wet, as applying paint directly to a dry brush is the fastest way to ruin that brush. But also, after we have cleaned off our brush or after we're just wetting it for the first time, we want to maintain our brush's wetness baseline, just like we did with the wet palette. So these little water drops here on the edge of your brush, this is the fastest way to flood a miniature or your palette with more water than you want. Whenever I see these, I immediately touch them down to the paper towel. They get absorbed, but the brush itself stays moist. Right around here is where we want to keep our brush pretty much at all times when painting, damp but not soaking wet. You're also going to notice that by drying off our brush, we get this nice little damp spot towards the bottom half of the paper towel. That's going to come in handy later, but for now, we're just going to put a pin in that. So now that our brush is damp, it is clean, we can finally use it to grab some paint from our palette. Being careful, as always, to only get the paint towards the tip of the bristles to keep your ferrule intact. I'm sure you've heard that tip before, but it's always worth mentioning again. Now, before we apply paint to our model, I recommend at the very least touching your brush to the paper towel to wick off a little bit of the moisture. And wiping off the excess wetness here has two functions. Number one, we are removing excess moisture to avoid the paint flooding onto the model. And number two, we are twirling our brush a bit as we do this, maintaining the brush's tip. However, picking up on our note from before, our paper towel is not just a static thing that removes moisture. It is a gradient. For example, wiping off excess paint on the damp part of the paper towel will result in a more damp, more thin paint application. This can be good for layering or blending. Meanwhile, wiping off your excess paint on the drier part of the paper towel will result in a drier and often slightly thicker paint application, which can be good for base coats or things like edge highlighting. So, although a paper towel may seem like a simple tool, I think it is actually a super important tool with a lot more complexity than we give it credit for. This may seem like a lot of extra work if you're not used to doing it, but I promise very quickly this is going to become muscle memory. So my routine for painting anything is wet the brush, remove the moisture, put the paint on the brush, remove the moisture, apply the paint, clean the paint off, remove the moisture, and you just repeat this over and over again, maintaining your brush's desired level of wetness for what you're trying to paint. I promise doing this for long enough is just going to become like muscle memory, but do you know what else is like muscle memory? That's right, it's doing the ad read for this video's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one website and hosting platform for all of your website needs. And it's extremely easy to use. Just pick from one of their fabulously designed pre-made templates or build your own template from scratch using their brand new design tool, Squarespace Blueprint. I've been using my current Squarespace site to host a gallery of my painted models, all of my painting reference documents, as well as an online store, which I've just added a few new items to if you're interested. This store has been super easy to keep updated, accepts a variety of payment options, and makes it super easy for me to sell anything I want, from painted miniatures to unpainted kits to digital STL files or print-on-demand items. So if you need a website, why not check out squarespace.com today for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Dana Howl for 10% off your very first purchase of a website or domain. And now back to our video. The second principle of brush control is thickness, or more specifically, paint thickness. Now, you may have heard a variety of opinions on how thin you should thin your paints, but here is my rule of thumb. Only thin your paints when you absolutely need to, and keep the paint as thick as you can on your palette otherwise. Of course, this advice may vary depending on the paint brand or the specific climate you're painting in, how damp or dry it is. But in general, when adding paints to my palette, I try not to thin them at all until I specifically need them to be thin. As for the paint brands that I typically use, including Pro Acryl, Army Painter, and Vallejo, I find they don't need much thinning at all for a base coat or highlight, especially in combination with the dampness of the wet palette and also removing excess moisture on the damp side of the paper towel. Using this workflow, for many colors, you only need a single base coat, but for thinner colors or colors that are a bit brighter, you might need 2 or 3 coats of the paint for a base coat. There are, of course, exceptions to this rule where we might want to thin our paints further. But before we get into those edge cases, I would first like to discuss the third principle of brush control, and that is maybe the most important one. Principle 3, texture. When applying paint to your model, you would probably assume that most of the time you would be using roughly the tip of your brush to apply the paint. And that may be true most of the time if we were painting on a flat surface. However, when painting models, you actually have a secret weapon which you can and should be applying 99% of the time. And that secret weapon is texture. Some obvious examples of using texture to your advantage includes dry brushing, washes, even zenithal highlights, or almost anything you're doing with an airbrush. But there are more subtle ways to take advantage of a model's texture as well. And one of the main ways that I've found that I like to leverage this texture when painting models is whenever possible to use the side of my brush instead of the tip. And you may have already noticed this in the majority of the footage so far in this video. I am almost never going in tip first. I am always instead gently using the side of the brush to paint my model, getting it as parallel as I can with the surface of the model and just dragging it out along the surface. The main advantage to doing this, as you can see, is that if you don't thin your paints too much, if you're managing your wetness properly, maybe you're using the non-damp side of the paper towel for your paints at this stage, the paint just tends to catch on the raised surfaces rather nicely, leaving our deep black shadows intact. As you might imagine, this makes painting virtually anything so much easier, as it almost removes aiming from the equation entirely. And the only time you will really need to use the brush tip is when getting color into those deep recesses of the model, or I guess freehanding stuff. You might want a sharp tip for that. And even when you are using the tip of your brush to get into those deep recesses, you can kind of use it like a wedge tool as well, still using the side alongside the tip of your brush, as you can see here. This side brush method also works great for highlighting areas of a model, as your brush is going to naturally catch on the highest, most textured points of the model where light generally tends to collect. In fact, when using this model, I tend not to even mind if the colors quote unquote go outside of the lines, as it's very easy to tidy that sort of stuff up later in a cleanup pass. Or sometimes you can just leave that stuff in and it looks like cool reflected light. Now, occasionally you may have a situation like this, where I went a bit too far with the flesh tone on the model. I wasn't careful, I got some of the color into the recesses, probably should have been managing my wetness and thickness a bit better. But as always, this is totally fine, as remember, texture is our ally. And so is wetness, and so is thickness. So let's bring all of the principles together to correct this mistake. So in a situation like this, where we want color in the recesses, all we have to do is the opposite of what we would usually do. We find a suitable shadow tone for our flesh, we apply it to our palette, and in this case, you can see I'm not wiping off the excess water of my cleaned up brush at all, and I am instead mixing some of that excess water that's clinging to the brush with the side of the paint on my palette. Note that we are not thinning down the entire paint globule at this point, as we might want some unthinned version of this color later. We're just thinning some of it off to the side, and then we do the same thing as usual, taking a little bit of the thinned paint on our brush. We still wick off that excess moisture on the damp side of the paper towel so it doesn't completely flood the model. But now, instead of using the side of the brush, we're now using the tip of the brush to direct this color where we want it on the model. And in fact, we can kind of use the brush tip at this point to move the color around on the surface of the model, pushing it into the recesses, onto the sides of the head where we might want shadows, and just generally anywhere we might want a color filter or a bit more shadow. If we get a bit too much on there, it's super easy to remove, as this paint is so thin that a clean, damp brush can be used to remove the excess or gently guide the color into the recesses of the texture where we want it. And well, sure, you could use a wash for this if you want. I think this method is often a bit more precise and allows you to control the exact amount of color and where it goes. We can even take this method a step further, applying a ton of this color to an area, not aiming at all, and then coming back in with a clean, damp brush to push the color into the recesses and away from the most raised areas, sort of like what I would call a reverse dry brush. This method, I think, works especially well when you want to tie multiple areas together by using the same shadow color like I'm doing here. And as you can see, with these three principles combined, you can paint almost anything. When I'm painting just for myself off camera, this is pretty much the two techniques that I use to paint things. I'll use a more dry paint to apply base tones and highlights, and I'll use a more wet paint to get paint in the recesses to apply glazes and filters. It's really all there is to it. Finally, there's one more topic that we should probably cover about brush control, and that is doing more subtle blends and highlights on your model. Subtle blending. In areas where we want a more subtle, gradual highlight over rounded or flat areas, we can leverage more subtle techniques in combination with our previous principles to achieve a smooth blend. In this situation, for example, you can see that I am working with a relatively thick highlight color, but I've also removed most of it on the damp part of our paper towel. So I only have a small amount of very thick paint to work with, but I've kept it relatively damp and I've removed most of it on the paper towel. When we apply this to the model, you can see it works to our advantage, as when we apply it to the surface, there's very little paint left on our brush, so we can then use the empty damp brush to push the granules of paint around into the places where we want them. Notice I am also using sort of a dragging motion here to drag the paint towards the area where I want the highest highlight. And then I am lifting my brush up right at the edge of that movement to leave the most paint in the final area where we want the brightest highlight. This can take quite a bit of practice, but you can also get quite quick and good looking gradients this way if you do that practice by just using a tiny amount of paint on your brush and of course the proper lubrication of that damp paper towel. So that is about it for today. Thank you so much for watching, as always. Thank you to all of our wonderful, generous patrons for your ongoing support over on Patreon. I appreciate it quite a lot. And with that, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.